Peter, how do you respond to these strong views on various aspects of your industry?
Well, there's much that I agree with, but I know, Martin, you always like a good debate, so I'm going to focus on something.
Focus on the disagreement.
Focus on the things I disagree with.
It's so boring.
I think going for any kind of new form of Glass-Steagall light or whatever is a complete and utter distraction, because I think it won't work. What's been proven in this crisis is that you can have supposedly narrow banks, and they can be bust, and they can go bust, and they can cause chaos. Washington Mutual, Northern Rock. You can also have supposedly pure investment banks, the likes of Bear Stearns and Lehman's, and they can go bust, and they can cause incredibly problems. And what you actually get through a sort of Glass-Steagall type of thing is people indulging in all sorts of forms of regulatory arbitrage, doing the same economic activity under a different name, under different rules. And I actually think that was one of the contributors to the crisis. I think the critical aspect now is actually to move to a focus on regulating activities regardless of what institution they're in, rather than focusing on the institutional structure. I'd like to pick up on the point about too big to fail and the sort of living will notion. I think there is a very important set of issues here, because the problem we have at the moment is that there's very little rationale to have market discipline within the banking system, because governments have either invested in or underwritten explicitly or implicitly so many of the participants. And I think one of the things we have learned over many, many years is if you only rely on regulation to restrain entrepreneurial exuberance, you will undoubtedly get a crisis. You need a bit of market discipline. And so somehow or other, we need to inject uncertainty into who is too big to fail, what happens to capital providers and counterparties when something does fail. And so, and actually, while I agree that regulators among themselves need to be clear what they're thinking about it, oddly enough, what we need in the market is a degree of uncertainty.
It's rather difficult to run a market economy without a notion of bankruptcy, isn't it? Let me turn to a second issue which follows from this, given your still pretty deep concern about the financial sector. What about the world economy? That also seems to be showing marked signs of recovery pretty well everywhere. What are the risks still out there, and what is likely to happen? What is your view on that, Bill?
We have some supply-side imbalances, because this demand-side stuff went on for such a long period of time that the supply side of the economy has adapted itself the way capitalist economies do, almost seamlessly. Now, what does that mean? I think what it means is the car industry is far too big, the banking industry is too big, wholesale distribution is too big, construction is too big. In some countries, retail distribution is too big. So we've got a lot of industries with a lot of excess capacity on the supply side. And in a certain sense, even worse, this is coming out of the trade side, is we now have half the world, and it certainly includes many countries in Asia, all geared up to provide goods and services to people in other parts of the world, mostly English speaking, who can no longer afford to buy the stuff that you want to sell them. Now, this is a major, major problem going forward. A real side adjustment to go along with the demand side adjustment. This will not be done overnight. So if people said to me, are we going into a W? I think almost certainly. Are we going into an L? I would not be in the slightest surprised. The only thing that would really surprise me would be a rapid and sustainable recovery from the position that we're in at the moment.
Peter, how far would you go along with the views expressed so far on the underlying deep problems we face?
The point is that markets are thrilled that we're not disappearing over the edge of the cliff, but I don't think anybody quite knows where we are going. We may not be going off the cliff, but we're not running anywhere else terribly fast either. And I think this problem that the world had this, if you make it very crudely, economic model where Asia produced a lot of stuff and the West, particularly the Anglo-Saxon West, consumed an awful lot of stuff. The English-speaking world the America and the US is not, and Europe in general, are not going to consume as much as they were before. So where is that growth in demand going to come from? That is a pretty fundamental structural issue, which I think its resolution depends partly on domestic consumer demand and the growth of services in Asia. But that's not a terribly easy thing to just produce overnight. The policy levers, the social changes, the way the markets evolve, that is going to take time.
We Chinese can manage our own affairs, but we cannot manage the world's affairs. And let's face it, the United States, EU, Japan add together, what, $40 trillion US almost of GDP, and China is 4.5. So how does 10% take care of, right, 100%, right?
So it can't be a locomotive for the world, it's not big enough. An area we really haven't focused on that much is regulation, and financial regulation in particular. I'd like to ask you, Peter, about this. What do you feel about the whole regulatory debate? Is it Ronnie's view was we are not getting to the point. Is it actually going to do harm or good at the end?
I actually think there have been some very positive developments. I think the creation of the Financial Stability Board, the intensity of discussion between regulators and central banks around the world, the acceptance that they need to be coordinated and consistent, I think is a significant step forward. But there are some real dangers. I mean, and there's no doubt that as an industry, we do need better regulation. And good banks get damaged by bad regulation. So we do need better regulation. Where I think there are dangers, one, that we focused on too much on closing the particular stable doors, solving the particular problems that we faced in this particular crisis, and in doing so, managed to create the foundations for a different sort of crisis in the future. And I do sort of sense us doing that in some ways. I think also there's something about financial services regulation which attracts a certain sort of technical priesthood who love detail and complexity. And the banks themselves are guilty of this, and the regulators as well. And then you throw the accountants in the mess, and you end up with a small industry of overly complex, opaque regulation. And you kind of lose sight of what you're actually doing in running a bank.
I think Peter's right with respect to the regulation. I distinguish between what I call the school of what is different and the school of what is the same. And there's a disconcerting tendency at the end of all of these big crises, and remark we've had these things for centuries, for people to focus on the stuff that was new and basically say, if we could just fix that up. In this case, the SIVs, the rating agencies, originate to distribute, CDOs, if we could just fix that up, all would be well. And frankly, it's very comforting for the people who are responsible for the governance of the system, that is to say the central bankers and the regulators, to do that. Because they can point at something new and say, you couldn't possibly have expected me to understand all the collateral damage, et cetera. Okay, so they focus on that. The real focus, and I'm glad to see it's coming through now with respect to the pro-cyclicality discussion, the real thing we should be focusing on is what is the same. Because these big crises, and I tell you, we've had them, there was a big one in 1825, 1874, 1929, Japan, et cetera. They all look the same. They all look the same in the sense of the run-up, the credit, the euphoria, the asset prices, the collapse. And that's what we have to focus on, the underlying imbalances that build up in these things, and how can we stop them out.
To quote, I think it was Andy Groves of Intel, only the paranoid survive. And maybe in your sort of business, that's actually quite useful sort of advice, because we do expect your part of the system to work under all circumstances. Thank you very much. And thanks to the panel.